Our keynote speaker this morning is Professor Roianne West. Born and raised Kalkadoon on her grandmother's ancestral lands in northwest Queensland, with connections to the Jakundi people in southwest Queensland. A mother, a grandmother. Professor West continues a family legacy of 4 generations of Aboriginal nurses and a long line of healers that include her grandmother, her mother, her twin sister and her brother, who are university-trained registered nurses. Also, twin daughters and many nieces and nephews who are studying nursing. Professor West has completed a Bachelor of Nursing, a Masters of Mental Health Nursing, and a PhD which developed a model of excellence for increasing Indigenous nurses in Australia in 2012. She was Queensland Health's first nursing director with a dedicated portfolio of Indigenous health and Australia's first Professor of Indigenous Health in a joint appointment between a state health service and a university school of nursing and midwifery. Professor West was Foundation Professor of Nursing, Foundation Chair in First Peoples Health, Director of the First Peoples Health Unit, which she was responsible for establishing, and the inaugural Dean of First Peoples Health at Griffith University. Professor West is an active researcher who leads the Gould study of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and cultural safety education, which aims to improve Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and cultural safety education through an Indigenous research lens. Professor West was recently acknowledged for her commitment in the area as one of Australia's first Aboriginal Principal Fellows of Higher Education and the James Cook University 2021 Outstanding Alumni. Please join me in welcoming Professor West.
Morning everybody, just give me a second to get set up. I actually haven't been to a Passion About Practice conference since Pauline Ross first started these conferences in late 1990s, early 2000s or something, way back when I was a baby nurse, so it's nice to be back again. And given that my role is at a national level now, I'll always be a Queensland born and bred registered nurse, as you would have heard from the lineage in my family. So I begin by acknowledging the Turrbal, the Yagara and the Yagara peoples on whose ancestral lands we come today for the ceremony of the Passionate About Practice Conference 2022. I thank the traditional owners for their custodianship over these lands and for warmly welcoming us here this morning and offering us safe passage for this very important work. As Anna said, I'm the daughter of a lifelong health worker. My mother was a health worker going on 4 decades and was the first Aboriginal health worker to be registered with AHPRA as a health practitioner a few years ago. And the granddaughter of a long line of healers. My people are the Kalkadoon people, the desert people from far northwest of Queensland, where the Mount Isa, the Northwest HHS now resides. And I pay my respects to these proud Emu and Sangorana people of mine. In keeping with custom, I acknowledge the elders, past and the present. I acknowledge your elders as well as mine and appreciate the work and the guidance that they provide for our communities and that they've provided for this great state. I especially acknowledge the work of the organisation I now have the privilege of leading, which is the Congress of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Nurses and Midwives, for their courageous leadership, and I especially acknowledge another great Queensland nurse, and that's the inaugural Chief Executive Officer, Dr. Sally Gould. Although a Wiradjuri woman, she spent the best part of her life living in Bribie Island and was the first Aboriginal academic for the Queensland University of Technology, School of Nursing and Midwifery. To the Office of Chief Nursing and Midwifery Office, who I've had the privilege of working alongside for many years since my days in Queensland Health, to my role now as the CEO of Katsanem, to all of my nursing and midwifery colleagues in the room here today and who are joining us online, who have some way already contributed to addressing the inequities that exist within our system. I acknowledge you, your leadership, your courage, and most of all, your persistence in light of the magnitude of challenge that lies before us. I also acknowledge your willingness to stay in the conversation again and again. Finally, and most importantly, I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses and midwives across Queensland Health and those that are joining us in the room today. And I make a special acknowledgement of the CATS&M members that are joining us here today as well. I thank each of you for your patience and your understanding, and most of all, your forbearance as we continue as nursing and midwifery leaders to figure out how to do this better for you, but also to continue to figure out how we do this better for the communities within which we serve. I wanted to share with you of the 32 founding members that gathered 25 years ago this year on Gadigal country to establish the Congress of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Nurses and Midwives, that a number of these phenomenal nurses actually come from this great state, and some of them that you will recognise are still working alongside you in positions today. This slide is out of sequence, but I'll talk to it, is that even the best preparation, you always get something wrong. That CATS&M has about 700 members that are in Queensland. CATS&M, the peak body, the voice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses and midwives nationally. We only have 304 members from Queensland, but very proud to say that our student numbers are increasing at a rapid rate at 195. This represents only 20% of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses and midwives in the state, and although our numbers continue to increase, we certainly are looking to have a much greater representation of Indigenous nurses and midwives as part of our membership as we continue to lobby and advocate for the betterment of inequities not only within Indigenous health, but the inequities that exist within Indigenous nursing and midwifery workforce. So here's someone that I'm sure you will all know. You wouldn't be a Queensland Health person if you didn't know this lady. So Haylene Grogan was one of our founding members. Haylene is this country's very first Deputy Director General of Indigenous Health. Having people like Haylene Grogan in that role has certainly given us great traction in the relationship between the Division of Indigenous Health and the Chief Nursing and Midwifery Office. So I'm actually going to use some of your own Indigenous nurses and midwives to help me through this presentation. And Haylene's been a great supporter of the work of CATS&M. Another product of Queensland is Dr. Sally Gould, who I spoke about previously. So Dr. Sally Gould was the very first Aboriginal nurse for the very first Aboriginal medical service in this country. And I guess what I'm presenting to you is about possibility. And often I hear about we have too few Indigenous nursing and midwifery leaderships in this country. And what I'm going to show you today is some of the extraordinary Indigenous nurses and midwives that are doing and continue to do extraordinary work across this country for our professions. Aunty Sally Gould's at the, still with us on Bribie Island at the ripe old age of about the mid-80s and still continues to give me very, very sound and very strong advice as the current CEO of the organisation, and has been very important in my transition into this role. It would be remiss of me not to acknowledge the International Day of Midwives that occurred yesterday. International Day of Midwives is celebrating 100 years of progress. I want to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses and midwives as this country's very first midwives. Prior to the establishment of nursing in the 1860s, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were doing nursing and midwifery long before colonisation existed. So this year, this is what we put up on the post, is unfortunately the inequities that we deal with within the health system exist within nursing and midwifery workforce, in that at the moment we only have about 350 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander midwives in this country. And if you think about the demand and the high rates of infant mortality and the high rates of Aboriginal babies and mothers dying at birth, the demand on Aboriginal midwives is significant. In regards to the programs of work that's been led out of the Chief Nursing and Midwifery Officer in particular, and I acknowledge Joss Toohill as well, I can't see her here, for her leadership as the Midwifery Advisor, and the Chief Nursing and Midwifery Officer for making space for these important issues to be addressed. So the Growing Deadly Families work is absolutely critical. The normal birth work, absolutely. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander midwives are fundamental to all of these programs of work. And unless we make a commitment to increasing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander midwives, we will continue to grapple with these issues. So in order to address the inequities within our health system with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the most significant strategy to do that, and all of the evidence that tells us this, is you need to increase the number of Indigenous nurses and midwives within the system. So a little bit of an outline of what I'm going to be covering today, and Shelley set a really nice scene for me to follow. I'm going to talk about the nursing and midwifery profession rising to what's becoming what is one of our greatest challenges, and that's addressing the inequities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and I know Queensland Health has the greatest equity agenda of all of the state and territory services across the country. It is well known that Indigenous Australians are overrepresented across every aspect of Queensland Health system, and the appalling state of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is undeniably an impact of both colonisation and racism, and these are the issues that we have to be able to talk about in order to be able to start to address those issues. And while this sounds like a very bleak story, there's absolutely enormous hope, and Shelley's already started to talk to some of the extraordinary work that nurses and midwives are leading, not only within Queensland, but across the country and also internationally. And this will be the focus of my presentation today. The first is to talk about the role of Indigenous knowledge within nursing and midwifery. The second point is to talk about the role of nursing and midwifery leadership, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And the third is to talk about the role of education and the need to make a commitment to culturally safe nursing and midwifery practice. So to begin, the role of Indigenous knowledge in policy, education and service delivery is absolutely paramount. Let me give you as an example the acknowledgement of country that we made at the commencement of this session. We conduct an acknowledgement of country because of the unique, distinct contribution made to humanity by Australia's First Peoples. By the acknowledgement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures at the beginning of these sessions, we open up the way for unexplored potential that exists for two-way learning between Indigenous and Western knowledge systems, and new and more sophisticated ways of working together are absolutely made possible. Our people have maintained a continuous connection to each other, to their culture, to country, longer than any other human group on this planet. In the process, we have acquired deep knowledge, understanding, and experience that can only come from such a sustained relationship. It is right here in this country that our ancestors, beings, forged their resilience and handed to us the legacy of our ancestral beings and the responsibility for the future of our people. Through massive change in landscape and human development, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have continued for more than 60,000 years. This achievement is absolutely worthy of acknowledgement. Every time our professions begin a meeting or a symposium or any forum with an acknowledgement of country, we are making real a rightful intersection of an ancient land and the planet's oldest living human cultures to combine, giving us a national culture and way of life. And acknowledging the traditional owners at the beginning of the session, I show my respect to them, to their ancestors, for their continuing leadership and for their ever-evolving social, cultural, spiritual and religious bequests to the state. It opens the way for Indigenous knowledges to be recognised as critical in delivering on the promise of addressing inequities in health outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I wanted to share with you and another Queensland nurse, Aninola White, who's worked right across the state and is recently retired, but was a leader in your Inala Primary Healthcare Centre, and I've seen nods of the head. She's also a very strong mentor of mine, and fingers crossed that this is going to actually work, because what I'm now going to present to you is Indigenous knowledge in many forms, but in many forms as they come from your own Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses and midwives.
Never lose our motto, unity and strength in caring. From the beginning, that was the motto that the group at the first meeting chose. So it was unity, us all getting together, and the strength would be the strength from each other, and then the caring, because nursing is a caring profession. we've come a long way, and keep the strength going and bond together.
So I wanted to share that with that clip with you in particular. The Congress of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Nurses and Midwives, like I said, was established 25 years today, this year, and there were 32 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses that gathered on Gadigal country, and I've been trying to reconnect with them in my new role. And they tell me the reason why CATSIN was established, which is what was formerly known as, is because of the severe shortage of Indigenous nurses, and in particular in the major teaching hospitals down in New South Wales, and their concern out of that. The other reason is because they wanted to have a voice to be able to advocate for the poor health of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They wanted to have a collective voice for that. And sadly, the other reason was because of the harm that racism was actually doing on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses. And I share that with you because unfortunately some of those issues 2.5 decades down the road we unfortunately are still dealing with. CATSIN was established with the primary intent was to actually increase Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses, and at the time in which it was established, Indigenous nurses occupied about 0.5% of Australia's nursing workforce. In 2019, which is our most recent data set, unfortunately Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses only occupy 1.3% of Australia's nursing and midwifery workforce. I'll share that statistic with you. The 25 years provides us an opportunity to celebrate the work that we've done in that 2.5 decades, but it also provides us an opportunity to reflect on what we need to be doing better. Unfortunately, if we continue on the current trajectory, that Indigenous nurses will continue to remain only about 1% of Australia's nursing and midwifery workforce. And if you have a look at the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people within Australia's healthcare system, and particularly within Queensland Health, and I say particularly within Queensland Health because population statistics tell us that the highest percentage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people live in New South Wales. But projections tell us that the highest percentage of Aboriginal people will very soon be within Queensland, and the fastest growing population within Australia is actually in the Gold Coast HHS area. So there's a particular impetus, and it should be anyway, that Queensland needs to be prepared for what is actually in the health system and what potentially is coming, and increasing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses is absolutely fundamental, or we will continue to grapple with that issue. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is because there's such a small percentage of the workforce, purely because 99% of voices are being heard, our work continues to be slanted towards increasing the cultural safety of non-Aboriginal nurses and midwives, which is absolutely critical to do, but not at the expense of investing resources and strategy into increasing Indigenous nurses and midwives. So what I'll talk a little bit further about later in my presentation is that the best way to get a culturally safe nursing and midwifery workforce when caring for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is not the most exquisite education program you can have, which is what I think the program is I'm going to share with you later today, but it's increasing your Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses and midwives. Because it doesn't matter how good our education programs are, the knowledge set that an Indigenous nursing and midwifery workforce comes with cannot be taught within an education program. So a couple of pieces of work I wanted to share with you in particular. In 2000, so when I commenced as a CEO just on 18 months ago, the first thing I wanted to do, and something that often happens in Aboriginal health, is Einstein's definition of insanity often resonates with me. We keep doing exactly the same thing but expecting a different outcome. And I wanted to walk the talk. So I didn't want to talk to my non-Indigenous nursing and midwifery colleagues without myself reflecting on what the organisation has achieved. Why hasn't it worked? Was just the times of it, which it absolutely was. So in 2002, the nursing leaders for CATSIN led out with the Council of Deans of Nursing and Midwifery to release this report called Get Them and Keep Them, and simply get Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses and keep them within the system. That's important. It's still important today because we know that our commencement rates within universities are escalating, upwards of 300% across some universities, but unfortunately our completion rates are not in keeping with those commencement rates. So the Get Them and Keeping Them has a significant story behind that. So the Get Them and Keeping Them made 32 recommendations in 2002. The aim of that report was to increase Indigenous nurses. I'll say it again, 2002, 0.5% of the nursing and midwifery workforce identified as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. 2019, 1.2% of Australia's nursing and midwifery workforce. So this absolutely needed to be evaluated, which is what we've done. And before the end of the year, a new report will be released. That's not only speaking to the Council of Deans in Nursing and Midwifery, but speaking to the regulation body, which is the Australian Nursing and Midwifery Accreditation Council, which is a subsidiary of the Nursing and Midwifery Board of Australia, again led by another great Queensland nurse, Adjunct Professor Veronica Casey. So Queensland is very well represented at a national level as well, and it's a very proud moment when you walk into these meetings and you see a number of your colleagues from Queensland, so we're very well represented. The other important release that's coming very soon is in 2005, Katzenam let out on a book that was the very first in the country in our own right, Black Australian Nurses Stories, and it privileged the stories of 25 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses within Australia. If you haven't read this book, please get this book. It's probably an expensive buy. It's upwards of about $250 at the moment, but it's on Kindle for $70. And if you can't get this book, sit with an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander nurse and truly listen to the challenges of being an Aboriginal person working within the current health within the systems that we have today. So the stories represent, we know that one of our strategies for increasing Indigenous nurses, you can't be what you can't see. So presenting Indigenous nurses with role models, with leadership, of extraordinary examples of nurses that achieved above and beyond what they thought was possible. We see the In Our Own Right second edition as fundamental to increasing Indigenous nurses, but also privileging the experiences of being an Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander nurse working within the Australian healthcare system. So at a national work, we do a significant, and this is, when I say we, that's a collective Katzenam, we do a significant amount of work with the Commonwealth Chief Nursing and Midwifery Officer. We do a significant amount of work with the Nursing and Midwifery Board of Australia, in particular around the practice standards. The most recent piece of work was in 2018 with the new codes of conduct for nurses and midwives, where racism and white privilege was introduced, and there was a significant amount of resistance to the introduction of those concepts into those codes. However, the silver lining in that was the solidarity between nursing and midwifery national peak bodies to say we're ready to deal with this issue and we're ready to take this issue on. So it was fantastic for us, fantastic for nursing and midwifery. So it's not only fantastic for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, because this is fantastic for Australia's healthcare system and fantastic for our two professions. We do a significant amount of work with the Council of Deans of Nursing and Midwifery. That's a really important piece of work, given that our main pipeline for any of our nursing workforce, and Shirley talked about this, is the pipeline coming out of both university and the TAFE sector. So we know that in Australia we've got just on 5,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses and midwives. It sounds like a significant number, but it's not when you think that we've got nearly 500,000 strong nursing and midwifery workforce. I'm sharing this with you because every year the Nursing and Midwifery Board actually produces a fact sheet on data for registered nurses, registered midwives and enrolled nurses. And last year, the year before, we were successful in lobbying for a data set specifically about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses and midwives, so we can use very accurate data to be able to determine and develop strategies that are evidence-informed coming out of the Katzenam. So a couple of quick facts. We know that our average age is 42 years. We're younger than the broader nursing and midwifery workforce. We also know that we have more males within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nursing and midwifery. So some of the areas that we're grappling in the broader nursing and midwifery workforce, we're actually doing better within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workforce, which is really interesting. And we know that we've got around half of our nurses that are sitting in metropolitan areas. And it's the reason why, when I talk later about Mullumbimullengaris, when we're developing any of our innovations out of Katzenam, that the reenactment I'm going to share with you is actually in a metropolitan area, and it is actually in an acute care setting, because we wanted to design and develop curriculum innovations that were targeting where we were going to get our best bang for buck, so to speak. So this is the bit, now I'm down to Queensland, this is the bit that I find very rewarding, not only because I'm a Queensland nurse, I get the privilege to work with all the chief nursing and midwifery officers across the country, enough to know that we've got a bit of a state of origin going on between Queensland and New South Wales. If we look at the Indigenous nursing numbers and also nursing and midwifery numbers more broadly, it's certainly tit and tap between New South Wales and Queensland health. But obviously being born and bred in Queensland, I've got a little bit of a bias towards working with the CNMO for Queensland Health, and having worked within 2 of the 15 HHSs as a clinical nurse, and then more broadly having a broader understanding in those relationships means that the momentum that we're getting within the CNMO at the moment is significant, and I'm excited about sharing some of the work today. So in Queensland, this is your numbers. So we've got, this is across the state, so not just Queensland Health. So we've got 1,200 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses and midwives, and this includes enrolled nurses as well. And you can see New South Wales is just above. Victoria's got a lot less numbers. And if you look at the membership for CATSNM, it's pretty much between New South Wales and Queensland where we've got the state of origin going. And I've thrown out the challenge to all of the nursing and midwifery leaders across Queensland that we want to surpass New South Wales in this year on our 25th birthday. So appreciate your help with that and joining up any nurses to become members of CATSNM. This is some data that I wanted to share with you that we're looking at through QuinMEX. I'm making an assumption people know QuinMEX. QuinMEX are the Queensland Nursing and Midwifery Executive Council. Is a governance mechanism established by the CNMO. I've been sitting on QuinMEX for 2 terms, initially as the Professor of First People's Health with the School of Nursing and Midwifery at Griffith, and now as the CEO of CATSNM. And we're looking at the 2 major issues for us around completion rates, employment rates for our graduates in particular. Shelley also spoke of that. And secondly, around Indigenous nursing and midwifery leadership. So we're looking at the data and we can see the distribution of Indigenous nurses, and you can see a majority of those are sitting in the grade 5 and 6. You can see a bigger number moving into 7 and 8, and certainly the Nurse Navigator program, seeing a lot of increase in the CNC role for Indigenous nurses, but you can see a major drop-off then when we go into the NG9s through. So if you want to have leadership in Indigenous nursing and midwifery, it can't be 3 people that are doing it. So it's about sequencing how you do this, and for me, my advocacy with the CNMO is around increasing Indigenous nursing and midwives, and not just escalating them and putting them in a position without a coaching, a mentoring or a leadership development program to allow, like any nursing positions, to allow them to be able to grow into that position. So I'm not sure if those numbers are few to people, but it's just a demonstration of how we're using the data to be able to make sure we've got much greater strategies in this area. And that's not unique to Queensland. So if we'd done the same analysis in New South Wales or Victoria, it would be almost exactly the same, although their grading system is different. That's QuinMEX. It was a step behind me, it was coming. So this is the vision for the CNMO, their strategic plan, and I was lucky enough to work alongside the team with this one. The vision is nursing and midwifery will provide leadership, informing and advancing policy, and a world-class health system that ensures a person's health needs and choices are prioritised to deliver healthier and sustainable communities. So as CATSNM sits at the table, we ask the question, what does that mean for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? What does that mean for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses and midwives? So within the strategic plan, and in particular the platforms around leadership capability, workforce sustainability, innovation and accessibility, I've highlighted here where the elements that are particular to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the equity agenda, and understanding strategy and getting these types of things in there so that we can get the resourcing and start to think around this is really important to do. What we've been able to demonstrate across the number of years is the significant amount of work that's been happening out of the CNMO and also across the state, and also acknowledge that the CNMO had a nursing director for Indigenous health way back in the early 2000s with Professor Odette Best, and they had the very first Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nursing and midwifery strategy back then as well, and that was under the leadership of Pauline Ross. So very excited today to share with you some great news, in that the CNMO is just about to lead out with the Queensland Health's second Office of the Chief Nursing and Midwifery Officer, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Nursing and Midwifery Plan. So we're very much at the beginning in that, but we've spent a number of years lobbying and demonstrating that we need strategy. We don't need a shopping list full of ad hoc machine gun approaches on how to do this. We are clearly grappling with this issue. We've been doing this for a number of decades and our numbers are still low, so we need a strategy to be able to do this. I'm very excited to be able to share with you today that this is the direction that we will be heading. Just in closing, I've got a couple of minutes left. What I wanted to talk to you about, and I'm hoping most people have heard about this, I had the opportunity to present at your grand rounds a couple of weeks ago in regards to a new program called Mullumalangari. Mullumalangari was a program that I inherited, but we secured funding from the federal government on the back of the introduction of the new codes of conduct for NMBA. So the 2018 codes, and how do we develop professional development to support nurses and midwives to be able to work in accordance with the code of conduct for nurses and midwives. So we released Mullumalangari a couple of months back. We're going into the second delivery of Mullumalangari. Early bird enrolment's open on the 1st of June. But what I wanted to share with you today at the grand rounds, I shared a little bit about the program, and I'm assuming that information is available, Anna, that was made available about the learning outcomes. Importantly, this program does not substitute any locally based cultural safety, cultural awareness, cultural competency, cultural capability. I say that because it's called different things across all states and territories. It does not substitute any of that. It enhances that and provides opportunities for nurses and midwives to truly have strategies to facilitate lifelong learning in this area. So I'm hoping you might know this lady. So this is Adjunct Professor Alison McMillan, and I'm going to share with you just a small video from her about Mullumalangari.
My name is Alison McMillan, and I'm the Commonwealth Chief Nursing and Midwifery Officer. We know that a pathway to building the Indigenous nursing and midwifery workforce is to increase cultural safety practice for the wider nursing and midwifery workforce and the cultural safety of processes and systems. So I'm really pleased to support the Mullumalangari Cultural Safety e-learning training, which is a key for the Australian nursing and midwifery profession and the pathway to better health outcomes for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
I'm really excited about Mullumalangari. One of the unique innovations about Mullumalangari is that the research program that Anna introduced in my bio designed and scientifically validated a tool to measure the impact and efficacy of this type of training. So when you undertake Mullumalangari, the option there, and we hope people take this option as we are moving towards having much greater rigour around Indigenous education and cultural safety, is a research program that's measuring the efficacy of this training. So if we're not seeing any improvements using this scientifically validated tool, obviously we need to be doing things different. The reason why that is fundamental is because we've been doing cultural awareness, cultural Indigenous health education since the early 1980s. For anyone who's been around since then, the early 1980s, and my mum was a part of this agenda as well. And my mum makes me shiver because she still talks about cultural awareness, and the conversation has shifted significantly from there. The most significant difference being cultural awareness is about learning about us, and cultural safety is about learning about yourself. So there's been a real paradigm shift in that, and we've been doing this for 50 years, yet we're still continuing to get the same outcomes and continuing to deal with the same inequities. And our federal government and our state government's number one strategy is a cultural safety training. So if that's going to be our number one strategy, apart from increasing the Indigenous nursing and midwifery workforce, we need to be doing that much better than we have historically. So the next, what we built into this scenario, so I come from a decade in the university sector, so I've been in higher ed. What we built into this scenario in Module 3 is a reenactment. It's a reenactment of an Aboriginal patient being in a ward in an acute care setting. and I'm going to introduce you to two people now. One is Brenda, who is the Aboriginal nurse on the ward, and all of the reenactment does is to provide a scenario to start conversations between Indigenous nurses and midwives. This is Brenda.
I'm Brenda. I'm a proud Aboriginal woman and I've been working as a nurse for 4 years. And if I'm being honest, there's a lot of ups and downs. I don't know if people understand what it's like for us Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people working in health. Sometimes it's the little comments, people talking about our mob in ways that are inappropriate or sometimes just racist. I don't even think it's done on purpose half the time. When I heard about this most recent incident, I was mostly surprised that someone was taking it seriously. I see these kind of things happen all the time. So when people forget to ask whether someone's Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, we aren't able to put them on the right pathway to receive culturally safe care. It's an educational thing. When it's not embedded in our educational system, it's never going to be practiced the way it needs to be. So I try my best, but I can't do everything. And it really hurts me to hear stories like this and to know that I was so close by and nobody asked me for guidance. But we've all got to take responsibility for our own learning too. I don't have all the answers because I'm still learning as well.
I've been teaching nursing and midwifery education for over a decade, and never one of my greatest reflections has I reached the ripe old age of 50 this year and become a grandmother is as much as I've been about improving health for my people. All of my education had the non-Indigenous nurse or midwife in the background of when I was designing and delivering training. And then all of a sudden, 25 years into my career, I had this epiphany that I myself was making Indigenous nurses and midwives visible. So when I was teaching curriculum, I could see a cohort of Aboriginal nurses here and I had to keep switching and acknowledging them rather than having that embedded in the way in which I designed the curriculum in the first place, or design it with them central to the curriculum. So I'm really proud that in this, I hope that Aboriginal nurses and midwives can see themselves in this. And like I said from the beginning, we can have the most dynamic education in nursing and midwifery, but the best way to get a culturally safe nursing and midwifery workforce is to increase your Indigenous nurses and midwives and then learn how to work with them. And if they're going to take on a role of educating their non-Indigenous colleagues, if they're going to have this greater, higher level of understanding and knowledge set, we need to make sure that they're validated, acknowledged and paid in accordance with that as well. So this has never been done before from what I understand, and I'm not going to give you the responses to these because you need to enrol in Mullumbimangari, and we are actually awarding the Lucky Door Prize today, which is a free registration to Mullumbimangari, so we look forward to that as well. The last person I wanted to introduce you to is actually the nurse unit manager. So I'm going to let you have a listen to Amber and just the different perspectives that we're attempting to present in this course, and in particular just to start the conversations.
My name is Amber and I work as a clinical nurse team leader. That day I was the team leader on duty. We were busy and short-staffed, but our team was getting through the task without much fuss. I've got a pretty killer team. My policy has always been that I don't see colour. I treat everyone the same. I'd heard people talk about cultural safety, but I never had much to do with that side of things, as we don't see many Indigenous people in our hospital. But I guess there are things that get missed here and there. To my knowledge, I didn't think incidents like these happen very often. I thought any issues with Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people was the responsibility of the ILO. So my focus stayed on providing the clinical requirements that the patients required. And this was my mistake. I've got to hold my tongue, own it, and make changes. When allocating patients, I need to consider cultural safety as well as clinical safety, as they're just as important as each other.
I should acknowledge that we had 5 Aboriginal nurses that were fundamental in designing the scenario. we also used the scenario that an NMBA has a scenario, a case study for all of the principles within the Code of Conduct. So we actually used the baseline for our reenactment was the case study used by NMBA around Principle 3 of your Code of Conduct, and then we brought in Aboriginal nurses that are working clinically and to raise what are some of the issues are. So you can see some cues around there, around the stereotypes that are there just to start a conversation, and then non-Indigenous nursing clinical colleagues as well who have moved a little bit further along their cultural safety journey and are starting to reflect on what they wish they knew, and when they moved into working into settings where there were high population of Indigenous people, how they had to change the way that they nursed in an area where there wasn't. So a lot of work has gone into the background of this, and it's not perfect, but I think we've got a long way to go, but I think I'm confident we're on the right track. So in closing, our distinguished nursing and midwifery professions have a unique opportunity to seize the promise of addressing inequities in Indigenous health in this great state, and along the way, with respect for two-way learning and new sophisticated ways of working together with your Indigenous nursing and midwifery colleagues, make real the point where the rubber hits the road in providing better health care for Queensland's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. There is so much extraordinary work that needs to be done, and I stand before two very extraordinary professions filled with outstanding leaders committed to delivering on better health and wellbeing for all Queenslanders. I talked about the need for the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge and strong Indigenous nursing and midwifery leadership, and I'm inspired by a strengths-based approach that makes a significant contribution to all of mankind, not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and all of the research which supports my convictions that solutions depend on the ability of all of us to learn and to teach while being respectful of two-way learning, and I look forward to new and more sophisticated ways of learning together. What I didn't say about Mullumbimangari, it's also the very first time that we've used Patricia Benner's competency framework for nurses and midwives to be able to assess where they sit between the novice to proficiency. And one of the things, and an introduction of a new concept called cultural humility. And you get introduced to Auntie Dulcie Flower, also a Queensland nurse, and the Redfern Aboriginal Medical Service, trained in Cairns, Redfern Aboriginal Medical Service, first Torres Strait Islander nurse. But the best, and she articulates cultural humility within nursing and midwifery just absolutely exquisitely. But for me, as a professor of First Peoples Health who's been in nursing and midwifery and has a family legacy going before me and after me in nursing and in midwifery, I will never be at proficiency with using Benner's framework, or if I am, I'm there for a short amount of time. The minute I change communities, change roles, I move all the way back down to novice and I have to work my way back up. But each time I work my way back up, I get quicker and quicker and quicker. And even now, 25 years as a registered nurse, I still catch myself slipping into a particular way of thinking unless I'm using a higher level of critical reflective practice within my nursing and midwifery, and that's absolutely what Mullumbimangari starts to present. We had some nurse educators who undertook the program and said the program, we didn't like it, it was different to anything we've done, and we said, job done. It needs to be different because for 50 years what we've been doing hasn't been working. We've had we've got leading Indigenous educators that have been working on the design of Mullumbimangari, as well as leading Indigenous and non-Indigenous nurses. So you're getting one of the most schmick products within this training, and that we hope that Queensland Health buys into this program. We've certainly had a lot of interest. So thank you for bringing your knowledge, skills, talents and experiences and styles of leadership, in particular to strategic thinking in nursing and midwifery. Thank you for the opportunity to present at this year's Passionate About Practice, and for the privilege of standing with you as my fellow nursing and midwifery professionals. Thank you.